the largest increase actually happened before the trade opening, trade liberalization, between 1981 and 1961. And that's where you had, 39% increase. If you move into the trade liberalized era, between 1991 and 1981, for Mexico, it actually declined a bit, and the same for the whole period from 2009 to 1991. The increase was negative, -2%. Are there any questions? By the way, don't hesitate if you have any request for clarification. I'll be very happy to do it. If you want to comment, I'll ask you to leave it for the end. But clarifications, I'll be happy to make. Yes? No, this is very macro data, and don't get. I mean, I have some disaggregation by income quintiles, but no rural urban. Yeah, I mean the data just don't allow for that. Yeah.
USA, how does it come to eating more chicken and less beef?
Well, I would say mostly price. Yeah, I mean, chicken are much more efficient than cows to convert. About 1 pound of chicken requires 2 pounds of corn, whereas you need about 6.5 pounds or 7 pounds of corn to produce 1 pound of beef. So, yeah.
Can you differentiate between calories consumed from animal sources, grains, and sugar? And do that concentration between countries?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do a little bit of that in a moment. Yeah. So, I mean, I've actually divided the food sources into basic foods and luxury foods. For instance, beer I regard as a basic food, wine, luxury food. But I'm not going to present that data here. Not today. So, this is, total chicken meat supply. You can see that, I mean, the rate of increase for Mexico is probably larger than the rate of increase in the other countries, but, I mean, consumption of chicken has really taken off. Now, to me, this decline here indicates that, at least for the United States, chicken was really a working class meat. And given the crisis, the financial crisis, people have had to actually contract their food intake. Not in Mexico, because the classes that have engaged in consumption of chicken are not so much on the lower end. They're in the middle and upper end of the income spectrum in Mexico. All right? And I guess that there's a similar profile in Canada. Now, if you look at the data for wine, for instance, wine consumption doesn't decline because the people that consume wine are not affected by the financial crisis. The beer data do decline. Okay, so fruit supply, kilocalories per capita per day. Fruit, by the way, I regard as a luxury food. I mean, it's really good for you, but not everybody can buy it. That's the pity. So Mexico has had an increase, no doubt. I would say these imported fruits, probably, I mean, some of it is imported. A lot of apples are being imported. By the way, apples are the cheapest of the fruits. Just to give you a comparison, most cereals are priced about $200 per ton. Apples are priced about $400 per ton, but that's the cheapest. If you talk about strawberries, they're about $3,500 per ton. Okay, so most of the fruits are in the thousands per ton. I mean, for bulk importation. Yeah.
So I just wanted to clarify when you say luxury good, it's not defined by the nutrients that come from the good to the person who keeps a benefit from it. It's defined by the price.
Well, in this particular case, both. I mean, one of the points is that I don't think that the main issue with regard to food intake is the quantity that people can eat. It's the quality. So people can have a lot of calories, but just not the calories that also have the nutritional content. I mean, fruit does have the nutritional content, but unfortunately, not many people in Mexico can eat fruits.
But your definition of luxury depends on whether they can get it or whether it includes basic necessities of nutrients.
Well, I think it just happens to coincide that the dearer the item, the more nutritious. I'm not sure about wine. I mean, I guess wine
There's
is.
an inverse. The opposite. My misunderstanding. The more nutrients, the more that it is a basic necessity, the more of a luxury it is. Maybe I'm
No, I guess the more basic food is the more energy dense and the cheaper. And the luxury food may be very nutritious, but also very expensive. So this is a similar analysis of the rates of increase. When fruit supply increased, and again, for Mexico, we have that the largest increase actually happened between 1981 and 1961. And there was a negative increase from 1991 to 1981. Overall, there was a small gain, though, between 2009 and 1981, but not at the level of the wealthier partners. And I guess, before NAFTA, Canada was not doing great in terms of food, but after NAFTA, Canada is the one that did the best. Even better than the United States in terms of increasing its fruit supply. Okay, so this is just NAFTA area cereals trade dependency, percentage of imports over domestic production. So a very basic measurement of dependency on the importation of cereals. Clearly, the country whose dependency spiked was Mexico. There was a little bit of a spike here in Canada, and my hypothesis is that was taking advantage of highly subsidized corn production in the US, and so some Canadian manufacturers started to import corn to produce ethanol. All right? I mean, this is just a hypothesis. I'm not really sure. But it was a very temporary, and it is well below the 20% mark. I use a 20% mark to decide whether a country is dependent on a certain food source or not. The FAO uses 15%, I use 20% just to strengthen the analysis, okay? Make it a little more conservative. So, yes?
In the NAFTA game, where do you see the importance, how much do you see the importance of the relevance of ethanol?
Oh, it has a huge negative impact. I mean, it's one of the most irrational policies that there has ever been designed. Because ethanol is unsustainable from an economic, social, ecological perspective. Even ethanol produced from sugarcane in Brazil, which is pitched as the most efficient, it's not. Without the pricing policy of Petrobras, ethanol in Brazil would not be sustainable. Plus, it is based in Brazil on nearly slave type of labor relations. So yeah, I'm absolutely against ethanol. Yeah.
To produce 1 gallon of ethanol, it costs you 1 gallon of gasoline.
Yeah, I mean, it requires more energy than the energy that it yields. Yeah, it's completely irrational. Okay, so this is how this food dependency translates in terms of prices. This is how prices have behaved since 2000 in the 3 NAFTA countries. Why have prices not increased that much in Canada and the US, but they have in Mexico? Well, partly because Mexico is a lot more dependent, and partly also because of other factors that I'm going to go into immediately, having to do with what's the percentage of household budgets that are spent on food. But I would say that the most critical component here is the food dependency. And ethanol, actually. I mean, I would say that a very large part of inflation has to do with the ethanol policy of both the United States, the European Union, Canada. I mean, just to give you an example of what happened in Canada when there were subsidies to produce ethanol, 26% of wheat producers shifted from producing wheat into producing corn for ethanol. So, okay, what I'm going to do now is try to move into the inequality of the situation. First, inequality at the national level or international level. What we have here, and I just constructed these yesterday actually, this is the household share of budget spent on food before 1990, 1996, 2000, 2006, 2008. There's no clear logic on the years I'm using because those are the only years that I had data for the 3 countries. So there were other years, but I only had 2 or 1. And so what we see is that Mexico, of course, started out, where households were spending almost half their income in food. About a quarter for Canada, 18% in the US. Almost everybody went into spending less money in food, except that Mexico has increased its food expenditures as of 2008. And I would say that has to do directly with all this issue of food dependency. So let me move into how that impacts different income groups. So this is the total, and I have this same kind of analysis for the United States, which I'm going to be presenting next, all right? Very interesting contrasts and similarities, some similarities. So what we have here is 3 years. So each bar represents 1 year, 1984, 2006, 2012. 1984, let's say, is before neoliberalism even, before NAFTA, before 10 years before NAFTA. And this is quintile. So let me start by asking, what is a quintile? I need to have everybody on board with that definition, because otherwise we won't understand. Can somebody tell me what's a quintile? Or what this, splitting society or an economy into quintiles, what does that involve? 1 sentence definition. Yes?
So I'm going to say it's where they are in the household income. So it's the lowest is the lowest 20% in terms of household income, and the highest 20%.
That's exactly right. Yes. So this is the lowest 20% of the population. This is the second in terms of income, third, fourth, up to the highest, okay? So this is the 20% wealthier people or households in Mexico, right? And so what you can see is obviously, I guess it should be expected, right, that the wealthier households spend much lower percentages on food than the poorest households. Is that clear? That much? Okay. So the next point to highlight is, what happens between 2006 and 2012. I mean, that's right before and after the food crisis, the global food crisis that started in 2007 with continued price spikes through 2011. Well, in the case of Mexico, the lowest quintile went into spending more than it used to spend in terms of percentage in 1984. So they became really worse off. And even all the quintiles actually started spending or having to spend a larger share of their budget on food. Every single quintile. Is that clear? This is official data from INEGI, Instituto Nacional de Geografía, Informática y Estadística. Yeah.
I think one of the things that you see, at least by this measure, is the before and after of the country of the Great Recession.
Mm-hmm.
What we're seeing is the result on food prices after the crash of 2008. But one thing that you haven't mentioned is the international demand for food, especially China's increased demand for food and grain products across the world. It almost seems as if Mexico and the United States and Canada are reluctant to a single trading relationship. Really, they operate on a worldwide scale. And I was wondering if you could comment on that just a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a fallacy because China is, for the largest part, self-sufficient. So it doesn't have much trade dependency. I mean, and I have the data not to present today, but yeah, I mean, China is not importing that much food. What it is doing, though, is, I mean, it is engaged in this phenomenon that, has been very talked about, the land grabs. I mean, they've been buying land in Africa, in South America, to produce, because, I mean, China does have only about 4% of fertile land in the world and about 25% or 20% of the population. So that's a big dilemma. And China has had the fastest growth in food consumption from 10 countries that I've been looking at. Yes, and
What about China importing soybeans?
it does import soybeans, but it's not dependent. It's not dependent by my measure of 20%.
And what's the history or motivation of soybean plantation? And what's the consequence for black beans?
Well, okay, that's not a clarification. I'll get to that in the question and answer section. But I'll just say that soybeans is one of the main vehicles for transgenics. Yeah.
I think this is called
Okay.
So, can you tell us, is this just expenditures, or does it include food that people produce for themselves?
Just expenditures, yeah.
Because my sense is that in 84, more households produced below chickens. That happened towards the edges.
Could be. Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a review of her book in AJS. No, it's fine. I mean, okay, this is for the United States. Okay, the same kind of analysis, but for the United States. So to me, one of the most surprising things was that, I mean, there's an incredible inequality, at least with regard to the poorest 20% of the population. And particularly in 1984, people were spending 59% of their income in food. I mean, that's a lot. That was even more than in Mexico. I mean, let me just go back quickly. See, in Mexico was 45%, in the US, 59%. Okay, so the poor in the US have more challenges, I guess, to access food than even in Mexico. Maybe because of what Gay mentioned there, that in the Mexican case, there were more people producing their own food.
I have a question.
Yeah.
To what degree are those phenomena explained by the forced choice between two necessities, say housing and food, where there's a very limited household income, and because both are rising, they're forced to choose between them. So that it can be reflected either in the rising price of food or the declining price of food, but it may also be explained by something else like housing.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I mean, I don't have data on that, but I mean, it makes sense. What happens in Mexico is, we're going to see in a moment, is that, I mean, the poorest quintile, they just have to become what officially is called food poor. People who cannot access even, the minimum for staying healthy. And, that leads to all kinds of problems of malnutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, this is just, what you can do with these macro data. And I guess the next step could be, maybe crossing it with, housing prices. Because, I mean, if any household spends anything more than 25% on housing, there may be problems. So, well, are there any other questions here? I guess one thing I wanted to note, in contrast to Mexico, is that aside from this first quintile, in which people did have to end up spending more after the crisis, all the other quintiles didn't. Whereas in Mexico, they did have to spend more. All the quintiles had to spend a little more in food. That's not the case for the US. So, I'm going to zoom in to how inequality translates in terms of, what's the total food and beverage expenditure as a percentage of the expenditures made by the highest quintile. So here we have only 4 groups. Oh, excuse me. Yes, we have the 4th quintile, the 3rd, the 2nd, and the lowest. So evidently the 4th quintile spends a percentage of food closer to that of the wealthier quintile, right? But this was the expenditure or the percentage of expenditures of the lowest quintile, much lesser amount. Are there any questions on that? Okay, so now I'm going to zoom in into a couple of luxury foods and basic foods. In the case of this luxury fruit, this is what the lowest quintile can spend in fruit, much less than the higher quintiles. All right? So in this particular case of fruit, which may be the most nutritious but also most expensive, not even the quintiles are able to spend as much as the highest quintile. But look at what happens with tortillas. Almost all of them spend more than the highest quintile, but not these, because these are way too poor, okay? So they cannot afford to spend even as much as the wealthier people on tortilla. Is that clear? So here we have, over 100% of what the wealthiest spent. And the same goes for sugar, except in the case of sugar, which is your most energy-dense food, look at what happens with the lowest quintile. And probably a lot of this is consumed in the form of soft drinks. Yes?
So just to clarify, all of these numbers are purchased within the formal time. So for example, tortillas, it doesn't take into account, or and through informal.
I think it does. I think it does, because I mean, these surveys that INEGI does, you know, they tend to be very, very thorough.
But
Yeah.
not production of your own. So if I'm making tortillas out of corn that I grew, that aspect of my tortilla consumption wouldn't be reflected in the numbers?
I think it should be covered. Yeah, I mean, that would be too big a chunk not to cover. Yeah. So, any questions on this? So it's clear, right? Okay, so I'm going into conclusions now. So basically, trade increased beyond expectations. I think, you know, from every country's point of view, trade increased at least fivefold than what it was before NAFTA. No doubt about that. Foreign direct investment also increased, but it increased a lot more in Canada and the United States than it did in Mexico. And I mean, these were the two explicit goals of the politicians that were negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement. And so on those lines, sure, they succeeded.